In this video we're going to be carrying on from the last video, so if you haven't seen that one, best to go back and watch part 1. So last time we installed AWS IoT Greengrass version 2 on the Raspberry Pi device, and this week we're going to be writing some code and deploying that via Greengrass to the device. So there's a difference between Greengrass v1 in AWS and Greengrass v2. Greengrass v1 was more cloud development centric. Greengrass v2 is more device centric development. So to make this a bit more easier and to interact with the real world, I've connected a couple of LEDs and a switch to the Raspberry Pi using the GPIO pins. So we're going to write some Python code that'll just flash the lights, or when we push the button turn the other LED on, and that way we can know when we've deployed the code to the device and we can keep track of it and interact with the real world, which ultimately is the end goal of any IoT project. Here's a schematic for what we've got connected on the board. So very simply, we've got GPIO 4 which connects to a switch that we can push and do some actions on that. We have GPIO 17 connected to a green LED and GPIO 18 connected to a red LED. And then we have this view to show you simply how it's wired up on the breadboard. So let's get started and log back in to the Raspberry Pi. So using the VNC viewer, just going to log back in where we saved our password before. And I'm going to open and use one of the default IDEs that was installed with that image. And I've already written 2 scripts. So one is to test the button and one is to test the LED. So we've got a separation of concerns there. So I will open the LED one first and talk through that. So here we just set the LED pins high and low to check that the LEDs are wired in correctly. So if I switch to the other view, you'll be able to see when I run this, the LEDs go on and they go off. And then I have a piece of code that just checks the push button. So if I run this one, every time I push this small switch, we should see this callback go in here. So that's the code written. Now we want to turn that into a Greengrass component so that we can deploy that on multiple devices, and then we can add some more and expand to that. So adding in MQTT control so that we can communicate with the Raspberry Pi from anywhere else, and also get back the status of the switch button to make the Raspberry Pi control other IoT components. So Greengrass components are made up of 2 parts, the artifact and the recipe file. So the artifact is actually the code that we're going to run, and the recipe is what tells Greengrass how to run that code, or any other parts that we need to do, such as install scripts to install libraries, or any permissions that we need as well to grant to that component to run on the device. So we're going to start just by simply making a folder to store our components in. And within that folder, we'll make another folder called artifacts. And a folder for the recipes. So within the artifacts folder, we are going to create the name, a new folder for the name of our component. So we'll call this Blinky. And within that folder, we'll have a version folder, which will be 0 within there, create a new file, tree. Okay, now we need to create the recipe folder as well. So we go back up to the recipe and we'll create a new JSON file that will have the recipe in that we want. So that'll have the same naming convention as before. And then the version number. Okay, so let's configure the recipe first and then we'll write the code. So hopefully this will open within an editor. Okay, not the greatest editor, but that will do. So I've just pasted this recipe file in there for now. So we have the component name, which should match the folders that we created earlier, which are on the left there. The name or description for that component, and within the component configuration we can pass messages or variables to the application itself. So here's just an example of that we won't use for now, but it's good to have it in there in case we need it later on to make it scalable for each device. For example, we might want to put in here in the default configuration, say which pin the red LED is connected to or the green LED is connected to, so that when the application runs, it can then look at this value before it runs that code. That way, if we move this code to another device where the green LED is not connected to pin 17 or 18, then we can just change that with the message variable within the recipe. We don't actually have to change the code itself. So I'm just going to save that. And go back to the code that we haven't written yet. So we'll open that. Hopefully that will open in the same IDE. No, it hasn't. I'll open it from here. Okay. So we just have a really small piece of code that runs through, sets up pin 17, which is our green LED, and goes into this while loop. So we'll just flash the green LED on and off, so we can test that locally here on the device. So push that, and we can see it flashing on and off. So that's great, that code works. And this will be really good because it will show us when, if we're looking at the device, we'll be able to see when Greengrass deploys this component and when it's running and when it stopped. Because as soon as it stops, we should see the LED stop in whichever state it was in. I'm just going to check the recipe again, make sure that the path we have is correct and the name is correct. And then we're ready to deploy that component to Greengrass locally. And we can use the Greengrass CLI to do that locally like we did to check the component list after we installed. So to deploy the component, we need to run this command, which is deploy create, and then the recipe directory and the artifact directory and the component that you wish to merge in with that version number that we put in the JSON file. So let's copy that and run that. Next we can check if that component is running, and I can see it isn't running because on the device the LED is not blinking. So we want to investigate what that could be. So let's have a look at the component list that we used earlier. And we can just check that the component installed correctly and if it's running. Okay, so I can see there the blinky is there, but it's in the broken state. Now, I'm guessing this is in the broken state because we've tried to access the GPIO from the Greengrass user that we created during the installation, and the Greengrass user does not have privileges to access that. So the next step is to grant that Greengrass user access to the GPIO port. So what Greengrass will do, it will try and run your component for a set number of times, which is configurable, and then eventually if it can't run that component after, I think the default configuration is 3 times, once it's run that 3 times, it will then just mark the component as broken, and it will leave it there waiting for you to action on that. There's a few ways to fix this problem, but first of all, let's check to make sure that that definitely is the problem. So if we open up an Explorer with privileges, then we can go into the Greengrass folder and look at the logs. So if I open the Binkley log, we can see that it doesn't have access. So that's the reason why it's not working. There's a couple of ways to fix this. So there's the quick and dirty method, which is the one I'm going to use, where we can just elevate the privileges of the component and require it to run as root when it runs that component, or we could add the relevant permissions to that user. I'm going to take the easy way and just update the recipe that we have. So I'm just going to copy and paste that to update the recipe to add that line. So we can see here we're just running the script at the moment. I've updated the recipe to add in this requires privilege true, so that's going to run as root. Let's save that. Now we could increment the component version and then deploy it that way, but then I'd have to copy those folders. As you remember, the folder structure, we had a folder that was marked 1.0.0, so we'd have to create a new folder called 1.0.1 and then put that artifact in there, which is good when you're in a bit further in production, but when you're just doing quick changes like this, it's a bit of a faff to have to go through all that process. So what I'm going to do is just remove the component and then re-add the component. The way to remove the component is to use this command. So deploy, create, remove, and then the name of the component. And we can just check to make sure that the component has been removed with the component list command. Okay, now that's gone. So we'll reinstall the component. And fingers crossed, we should see the LED start blinking when it installs. And there we go. We can see the LED blinking, so we know that that component's installed. And from now on, we'll know that the component is running every time that Greengrass restarts. If we see that green LED blinking, we'll know that component is running. So it's quite a good little test to make sure that we can deploy components and manage them. That's it for this week. We deployed a component to the Greengrass device, which made the LED flash. Next week we'll add in the push button and then get the two components communicating together with the inter-process communication, the IPC. If you want any more information or example scripts to copy and paste, they are available in the Greengrass documentation page, which I've got open at the moment. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.